So if you would please give a seated ovation.
Thank you all. Wonderful to have you here. And I want to start with thanking Kevin Snow and Michael. Vincent, where's Michael? There he is, who organized this. Many of you did some of our tours together for decades in History Colorado. They're now in the events business. If you need an event, talk to Kevin. First of all, I want to acknowledge the most important person here, the woman who's responsible for the whole many of my successes, my silent partner, Violet. And next, a special guest of honor, the woman who saved the Oxford Hotel, who gave this hotel a second life. And I think you know Dana Crawford is one woman. And as an example of how one woman can make a huge difference. Without Dana, would there be a Larimer Square? No. Would there be a Lodo? No. Would there be a Flour Mill Loft? No. And there's a long list here, but the lady is here herself.
Well, I wasn't really invited to be one of the roasters, but I did have to tell one story. Several years ago, the AIA, the International Association of Architects, had a meeting here. And this is disconcerting because they're playing music to what I'm saying, and the words and the music don't go together. But at any rate, I was supposed to take a group of the architects on a tour, and it started raining. So brilliantly, I invited them into the lobby of the hotel, and we hardly got in there that Noel didn't come catapulting out of the cruise room. And it was the middle of the afternoon, and that was a little disconcerting. But then when he said, "Oh, there's Dana Crawford," you know she was conceived in the cruise room. Now that's just one of the stories. My next speech will be on the subject of history is not what it used to be.
All right, there is more to come. For now, relax, enjoy your meals. At this point, we're going to dim some of the lights, so don't worry. You'll still be able to eat, I hope, with enough light. But Tom is going to come up and tell you the harrowing tale of his life. A tale of drama and tragedy, during which there was almost never enough to drink. So, Tom will be recounting, I will be doing the slides. So let me turn on his microphone and we're going to get going.
Okay, good. Testing. 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing.
All right.
David Sikora, can you hear us way over there?
I'm going to go turn out the lights. You can just sit here and I'll do the slides. So you want to head over? No, please stay here. That's right.
Well, what's not in here is my point of conception. And that was in the Moffat Tunnel. If you've been through that tunnel, but it's dark in there, it's kind of slow. So when people ask Dr. Colorado where he was born, I just tell them I was conceived in the Moffat Tunnel. And that usually ends the conversation. So here we are in the Moffat Tunnel. This is my little sister Janet and I. trying to get the family car started in Old Plymouth. Any of you recognize Plymouths when you see them? Can you see okay, Josiah? And here's the First Communion. I was, as some of you know, an odd Otari Day altar boy. And I don't know what was wrong with me, but I never seemed to attract the priest. My mumsy was a psychiatrist. She was a child psychiatrist, and in her office she had all these toys that people come in and play with. You know, like the dolls. What is this kid going to do to that doll? The house? How are they going to wreck the house? Where they would act out whatever problems they had at home. And we loved going down there to play with all those toys. And Jim, I think she diagnosed us early, didn't she? That's what our disorders were. And I loved her quote here, those who need love the most are the hardest to love. I suspect some of you are feeling that in your own life. And my father edited the law review and helped teach me to write, said, Tom, get the most important point in there first, make your pitch in the first paragraph as to why anybody should bother reading this trivia. Here's a picture of the family at home. Jim is the puzzled little guy up front, aren't you?
No, Tom. It's this one. We're talking about this one.
Oh, okay.
So it's your father.
That's my father. I'm glad Kevin knows what we're doing here. That was my father. And this is the family at home, all 6 kids, and my favorite Aunt Margaret there on the far left. I barely in the picture of Margaret. Jacob, who did so much for me. This was the very first book in 1976. How many of you have a copy? Oh, good. First of 55. Good for you, Caitlin. And this is the bestseller. It's done like 16,000 copies. This is the way, if any of you fellow writers out there to do it. Do it for the Chamber of Commerce. And then try to get them to get each of the businesses involved to buy 500 or 1,000 copies. That means 1 or 2 at a time. Any of you recognize this saloon? The Wasted Friday Afternoon Club used to meet there. The Wazee Lounge and Supper Club.
Yeah.
And Dennis Gallagher is in. Dennis, could you stand up for a minute? He is suspenders there.
You see my grandfather's suspenders in the picture behind the bar at men's wet goods as opposed to dry goods. And Tom researched and found that there were 382 people registered to vote there.
And they were all Democrats.
The Denver Republican asked, why do you have so many people voting here? He said, the homeless deserve a place to exercise their right to vote. Wouldn't he turn over today? They don't want the voting.
The best day of my life, was the day I married Vi, August 25th, 1974. Here's one of my favorite photos of Vi, age 3. Isn't she cute? Where is Vi? Oh, Vi, you want to stand up? Good. And here she is, the Queen's School of Nursing in Honolulu, at the University of Hawaii. I've been lucky to have a nurse for a wife. I recommend it highly if you haven't yet chosen for a beautiful nurse. Also, I was told early, marry someone whose family lives someplace you want to visit. I thought, this sure beats South Dakota or Iowa or Kentucky. I told me she was from Kauai, Hawaii. No matter how late I'd be out on the bar survey, I would be there in the morning with some coffee on. And I haven't quite given up the drinking business yet. spent 50 years teaching at CU Denver, which I love teaching there. You get older students who are paying their own tuition. Unlike the kids I went to CU Boulder and to BU with, where Dad was paying tuition and they were there to have fun on Dad's expense. But these kids were, I should say, were often married, were working, had children, still worked harder than many of the grad students I knew in Boulder who were still looking for themselves. Are any of you in that category? Oh, yes. Liz is back there.
I am. Still looking.
We had a lot of fun with many of you in the trials, like the trial of Alfred Packer, who was accused of camping in a national forest without a permit. Accused of, Dennis, I think you accused of eating meat on Friday. But he was defended as a holistic backpacker. Everybody went up to the mountains for the weekend with a party of 5 people, came back with just one. They felt easier the traffic would be on I-7. But we had a lot of fun up there at the Taper Opera House, which we filled with what they closed the balcony down later on. So as I mentioned, most of my life has been teaching, particularly on the Auraria campus near here, where I've had 5 different offices, wonderful career over the years. How many students are here? These are the best ones, too. I started doing walking tours with people like Kevin and Michael. And we often wound up in the cemetery, where we'll be again, by the way, with one surviving tour on Saturday before Halloween with History Colorado. And I also worked as a volunteer and then as associate to the associate director of collections. But I'm never a favorite of mine. And I hope you'll hear about this from Jim Kroll, head of Western History Department for years, spending so much time there. How many writers and researchers here have been there? If you haven't, it's like heaven for any pointer. Even Steve Weil got educated up there. And I wish Barbara Norman were still with us. I hope some of you remember what a wonderful lady she was. And what a delight to co-author with her. But probably the most important of my books is Buildings in Colorado. Covers every city, county, every county in the state, and where we try to get into one of the wonders of Moffett County or Baca County. Not just the Vales and Aspens and Steamboat Springs as well. I was asked to write the history of the Archdiocese, and I got into some trouble there, and the editors went through it, and they had a lawyer go through it, and he took out one of my favorite lines. The line that said, the Sisters Loretto took care of the girls, and the priest took care of the boys. My other problem in this book is Archbishop Stafford promised me I would go to heaven if I finished this book. And we took out all offensive sentences, of course. How do I carry that notice with me? Admit the bearer to heaven. Many of you know about that. Working with a wonderful archdiocese archives, where they have this model of the cathedral. Steve Leonard, where is Steve?
Over here.
Yeah, Steve saves me on a lot of books, figuring out all the problems at a time. This book that Steve and I did with Carl Abbott is now in its 5th edition. It's still the best-selling, best book on Colorado. Any of you that do not have that yet, Colorado, History of the Centennial State. This I did with History Colorado and the State Historic Preservation Office. We got to historic places around the state. It's stored with gaming funds. And any of you make donations to the casinos in Central City or Blackhawk, Cripple Creek, that money goes into restoring many wonderful structures around the state. Am I over time, Kevin?
No, you're fine.
Oh, okay. You'll blow a whistle, I trust. This was fun to work on. Whoops. Don't go far, Kevin. Likewise, Steve and I worked on this History of Denver, the Guide to the Metropolis, which we think is still the definitive book to date on the city, with a lot of statistics. We also covered the suburban counties there, which of course now populate Denver. This was Sacred Stones, the history of Red Rocks, which was a lot of fun. And I got some great stories up there, including Carl Dial, who runs the gift shop up there. And he said he went to see the Beatles play there in 1964. And he went with his sister, who was 2 years older, and 3 of her friends. And so here he was, this little 13-year-old kid with his 15-year-old girls. And of course, the minute the Beatles appeared on stage, can any of you girls do that scream? Try again. I knew Debra would catch this. One more time. And so she said, the minute they appeared, my sister and her friends all stood up in front of me, and the little 13-year-old started screaming. He said, I never saw the Beatles, and I never heard the Beatles. So I'm particularly proud of this. It won the Colorado Book Award for Best History Book of the Year and some other prizes. And again, I'm indebted to Steve Leonard and some others here for that. Isn't she lovely? And she's also very tolerant. And thanks to her, my zipper is up tonight. My shirt is buttoned. And I promised I would be clean shaven and sober at the end. This was taken when I was the night receptionist at Fairmount Mortuary and Cemetery, taking the grieved ones up to see their loved ones in the slumber room. But let's see, we should do this with, can I do a toast now?
You want to do a toast? Yes.
Yeah. All right, for all of you, better to be over the hill than under the hill.
So lift your glasses. It's Tom's favorite toast. If you would repeat it, Tom, I think not everyone was ready, so please lift your
Better to be over the hill than under the hill. Better to creak than to croak. Better to be seen than to be viewed. Again, thank you all for coming tonight.
So folks, everyone's going to get 5 to 7 minutes to tell us some wonderful stories about Tom. And so I'll just put in my 2 cents to begin with. I started all this madness back in 2009. Tom had already been at it for a long time, and he could have been very dismissive of the new person on the scene. He and I have only ever been kind and supportive to me as I've made my way. So for myself, Tom, thank you very much. Okay, let's see here. I think we start with Jim Noel.
I guess I'm here to talk about the underbelly, since it's a roast. And a few words from Tom. He's instructed me to say to you guys. As many of you out there tonight know, Tom is always organizing. He did that for his 4 younger brothers and a sister. We wondered if it was organizing or manipulating us to do the work. Instead of crying for a bottle, what he would do is pull on his twin brother's ear and get the bottle that way. One of his many Tom Sawyer tricks. Tom is the oldest of us, and he was the oldest by what, 2 minutes? Is that right, Tom?
4 minutes.
4 minutes, okay. So this is a roast. We have to look at the underbelly now and see what the other side of my brother was like before he was kicked out of the house. One of the things I remember very early on about Tom was he was trying to be a good student and join a fraternity, but he was kicked out of the fraternity for, he could tell you the reasons, but anyway. He was a little bitter about that, so he started a publication called The Voice of the Independents, people that would not join fraternities. And I remember as a youngster, one of my jobs was to edit his publication, with a Marxalot, a black pen, because he had already libeled someone. And there had been a strenuous objection by her husband. And so we had to go through and delete 2,000 copies with a black marker. In spite of that, we continued on. And, one of his goals was to get to the Peace Corps, and he was kicked out of the Peace Corps too. So it was around that time that my dad said, "You better go west and live with your Aunt Margaret." And we journeyed together out west in a Volkswagen Beetle. And one of Tom's favorite things to do was to stop at the gas station, which sold beer, and he would take my dad's credit card and have him put oil on the credit card. And that's how he made it to Colorado, I think. Once he got his beer, he would make a necklace of, in those days we had beer tops. It was an ornament for his Volkswagen Beetle.
The whole chain of pop tops. You never thought what the cops were going to say when he says, "You boys been drinking?"
And once he got to Colorado here, I think you all know what happened. I would tell you that one of the things he started, which is right here in this area, is something called the Wasted Friday Afternoon Club. Senator Gallagher will expound more on that. But one thing I would tell you is that as far as the Wasted Afternoon Club is that anything that's lost can be found again, except for wasted time. And what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about Vi and my nephew Christopher. Is he gone? Yeah, there he is. Yeah. Christopher has joined us, and one of the things he wanted to mention is if you spend any time with Tom, he's going to ask you to carry his backpack. And with Vi, she stood by him very well all through the ordeals here. And a quote which is attributed to Mark Twain is that history may not exactly repeat itself, but it does sometimes replicate. So here we come back to this part of town for a wasted Friday night, I guess, right? And my brother is so famous, one of my clients in my law office reception area actually stole one of his books. And we hope you can keep up with the books, Tom. Keep them coming. Thank you.
Don't go too far. So Tom has asked to be able to address any scandalous and completely untrue things that were said. So before you're off the hook, he gets to rake over the coals in case he said anything wrong.
Well, Jim has always been my favorite brother. And he was on many of his adventures in Volkswagens and canoes and other things. And I want to also say he is my attorney. He had promised to do any pro bono prosecution of any statements made here tonight that we do not approve of.
Okay, we're going on to our next person, and that would be Mr. Stephen Leonard. By the way, this is being filmed. Tom wanted to be able to send this to some people who are not going to be able to join us tonight. So we are filming this so that it will be able to be sent to
Jim, I spilled my wine. Could you fetch that glass spill in the rest?
I'll do that in just a moment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, for keeping me a little bit here.
First, I would say that my other roasters, or at least two of them, have yielded me any unused time that they may have, because I have an awful lot of nasty things to say. The first is I'm always having to correct Tom. He left out several of the books that he's written in that long, egotistical list of the good books that he's written, and they have been many, I must say. In fact, there were some that weren't even in there. But there was one which I have read, but I doubt if many of you have, but I'll ask in a moment, and that is the famous, well-known E470, It's More Than a Highway. Now, how many of you have read E470, It's More Than a Highway? We have one. Thank you. The winner is. Well,
David Segura's
David doesn't count. David put it together. He doesn't count.
Tom always travels with books in his luggage, and he will be quite happy to sell anybody else that happens to want to get it right after. Anyway, now I have to race through the rest of this. When Tom asked me to participate in this roast, I hesitated. I did not want to say anything unkind about a person whom I greatly respect, and one I consider high among my best friends. Although I must admit I have few living friends, so Tom feels How could I say anything demeaning about Dr. Colorado, even though he never has cured anyone of even a mild headache, and has been the cause of headaches, especially to his co-authors, librarians, and publishers, some of whom I see here tonight drinking strong liquor and popping Advil. How could I say anything derogatory about a man who has been propped up since 1974 by one of the best and most long-suffering people in the world, I refer of course to Vi, who has always cheered Tom on, and who despite his foibles has, as far as I know, never said anything more harsh to him than, "Oh, Tom." But then I reconsidered my resolve to be a nice guy. When might I get another chance to roast him? Even if his friends manage to repeat this splendid event every 5 years for the next 25 years, and even if he invites me to speak again after what I say this evening, I'll have at best only 5 more opportunities to toast and roast him. Hardly enough given his size and density, to make sure that he is thoroughly cooked. Being a duller historian than Tom, I will take a chronological approach. Tom is a son of distinguished parents. His mother a psychiatrist, his father an attorney, born on May 6, 1945, 2 days before victory in Europe and 3 months before the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, by the way, which its anniversary is today, for which he takes no blame. He is not exactly a baby boomer. He beat out his twin brother David by a 4-minute margin to become the eldest of 6 children. Tom was baptized by a heretic. These formative factors, I think, have contributed by strange alchemy to Tom's intelligence, his intense drive, his competitiveness, his productivity, as well as his adaptability, agility, and affability. He has a strange constitution. His bones and his arteries are not the best, but his mind, despite many rumors to the contrary, is among the best I have seen. As a young man, he spent a week in a cemetery in the U.S. and a week in a cave in France, where he practiced his French and got in touch with his Neanderthal self. These experiences made him a spiritual Neanderthal and qualified him to write Colorado Catholicism, which languishes, I suspect, unread somewhere in the caves of the Vatican Library. In Denver since 1966, he took a bachelor's degree in history at the University of Denver, attained a master's degree in library science. He taught school as a lifeguard, a soda jerk. Notice I said soda jerk. Worked as a roustabout in Antonito, picked up dead people for Fairmount Cemetery, slaved as a lowly paid adjunct at Metropolitan State, where I was briefly his boss. In 1978, he got a PhD in history from CU Boulder and solidified himself as an illustrious public historian at the University of Colorado, Denver. One thing that he didn't mention, and I would like to mention, is that he had a 15-year sentence to the Denver Landmark Preservation Committee in one of its most productive periods, and Denver is much the richer today because of the 15 years that he spent at the Landmark Preservation Commission. Obviously, and Dennis was much involved in much of that too, and of course Dana Crawford is one of the other, as everyone knows, one of the other stalwarts of preservation in the last 60 years or more in Denver. In early, obviously such a varied background suggests that since his late youth, he suffered from attention deficit disorder. Fortunately, from 1966 on, he had the great good fortune to be shepherded by his Aunt Margaret until she handed off that arduous and strenuous task to I. In early drafts of his first book, he was up there telling you about how wonderful Richthofen's Montclair was. He misspelled Richtofen until Louisa Ward Arps corrected him. Good women have the habit of rescuing Tom. They feed him and pamper him and inflate his ego to Zeppelin proportions. His co-authors have suffered the same anguishes in bailing Tom out. I must admit that he once could write in 2 days what it took me 2 weeks to do. Today he takes 2 weeks and I take 2 months. Having such talents, he naturally is inclined to overextend himself and to push co-authors into taking on more work than they bargained for. He charms them into doing that by inviting them to dinner, which Vi cooks. He knows and remembers a prodigious amount, but he sometimes makes mistakes. I recall some football scores he got incorrect, and he misspelled the name of a fairly obscure opera. In Denver, the latter can be forgiven, even unnoticed, but to get a Broncos score wrong is a capital crime. He has at times punctured my ego and endangered what little good reputation I have. He knows that I don't own formal attire. It shows up so infrequently at Goodwill. So he set up this dinner as a formal affair and left me to brush the moss out of my only halfway wearable jacket, which of course revealed the holes. Once we were on a hike, of which we have enjoyed many, when it started to rain. I fashioned a raincoat from a garbage sack. He took a picture of me in my sad sack and donated the photo to the Denver Public Library, where it will remain online forever. How can you hate a man like that? I trust as we listen to the other roasters, even now sharpening their knives, we will find out how.
If Steve Leonard ever asked you to rewrite a book, co-author a book with him, don't do it. Ever since I wrote, he would look at me in the eye and say, "Is that really true?" History can be improved upon, folks. Anybody can tell the truth, Steve. But to tell a convincing lie, that's hard.
Well, Tom, you should know because you've done enough of it.
And yeah, we're good. Thank you. See you next time.
There we go. I just wanted to say that, like many of you, I've read about William Byers, I've read about Bonfils and Taman, Gene Serby, but tonight we're in the room with one of the great editors of newspapers in Colorado, Patty Calhoun. Tom's roast. We're going to cover it all up tonight. We will film it for the rest of you. Okay. All right. Well, off to that gracious start. Okay. Tom has written over 50 books, taught thousands of college students, given tours to perhaps several 100,000 Denverites, visited over 500 bars for his survey. But the group we overlook are those who know him well, perhaps the best. The group that has the most tales to tell, the bartenders. Okay, I am here today to honor Tom for the many hours he spent with bartenders. And they asked me, Tom, to remind you about the tip jar. Among my earliest recollections about Tom involved Vi, who I heard once say with great conviction, quote, "Tom, if you are not home by 11 o'clock tonight, I am locking the doors and you can sleep on the patio." I don't know whether Tom ever slept on his patio. I do know that he replaced the lawn furniture on his patio many times. And to Vi, thank you for loving Tom. Thank you for sharing him with us. Okay, to those of you out here, how many of you have called your spouses from a bar explaining that you are with Dr. Colorado? Your spouse thinks that you are having an erudite discussion. By the way, today is my wedding anniversary, and once again my wife, Joan, is with me on another boozy establishment with Tom. She did not believe me when I previously called and said I was having an erudite conversation with Dr. Colorado. Tom introduced us to many bartenders at such notable establishments as El Chapultepec, the Squire's Lounge, the Cherry Cricket, and my favorite, the Mozart Lounge. The Mozart Lounge, many of you know, is located on Cremeria near Colfax. It is perhaps the bar closest to Tom's house. I recall many years ago, Tom gathered together a group of friends to go see Amadeus, a film about the composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who is depicted in the film as a dedicated party guy. Does Tom enjoy orchestral music? Maybe even opera? So I began perceiving Tom as a cultured guy. Years later, I discovered in a dictionary of slang that the word Mozart is just another term for being blottoed or drunk. So much for culture. Once, while riding in Tom's car through downtown Denver, he mentioned that he had another passenger to pick up. That was my first encounter with Butch, Noel, and the Sundance Gallagher. Everywhere we went, they enthusiastically met people they knew, and even others they didn't know. They even entered a restaurant on North Larimer in a blaze of glory. It was my nearest experience to being embedded in a marching band. I remember it as Mr. Toad's Wild Ride turns into On the Road with Bob Hope and Bing Crosby. Over the years, Tom has had many buddy stories with Dennis and others. This brings me to Tom's collaboration on several books with Steve Leonard. One day, Tom was visiting the library when Steve also walked in and was startled to see Tom. Steve proclaimed, "Tom Noel is doing research?" This needs some explaining. When you read their terrific historical contributions to our understanding of Denver and Colorado, especially from mining camp to metropolis, which, by the way, you can purchase on Amazon, hardcover today costs $211. Paperback is $14.13. I got the paperback. Or from the trunk of Tom's car, you can purchase these books. At the beginning of each chapter, from mining camp to metropolis, they mention persons, places, and events pertaining to a particular area in Denver's history. This part, folks, is Steve's contribution. Then suddenly the content shifts in the chapter to Tom's contribution, which is a conversation with a witness to an event, a politician, perhaps a resident of a neighborhood, or someone he just found along the way. Tom and his newfound friend shooting the breeze, which we professionally refer to as oral history. So you can imagine that when Steve and Tom were working together on a manuscript, Steve was researching in the library and Tom was conversing somewhere in the city and state with anyone he could find. For many admirers of Tom, a most perilous situation occurs at a cemetery tour with Tom and Dennis. During the tour, Tom likes to startle others, asking them to talk about famous members of the cemetery community. So for example, at Fairmount Cemetery, he would say, "Hey, Jackie, tell us about John Evans." Hopefully Jackie knew something about the Evans family. During these occasions, I usually hid behind mausoleums and large tombstones. Well, each time the jig was up when we arrived at the infants section. Low tombstones, nowhere to hide. That's when I heard Tom say, "Jim, tell us about these sweet angels." What did I know about the infants? Nothing. Then I saw 3 infants' tombstones with 1918 as their year of death. So I quickly said, "These infants died during the Spanish influenza." This is how I learned Tom's methods for researching history. Finally, one of the best customers at any bar was Caroline Bancroft, an inventive author of of Baby Doe Tabor, Molly Brown, and other legends. Caroline famously excoriated Tom in a published review of his first book. She truly saw a competitor coming down the road. Curiously, she and Tom shared a passion. They loved bars. Caroline liked her martinis, and after her passing in 1985, she continued to keep tabs on Tom, producing this scroll that she recently gave to me. It contains her corrections of Tom's books and articles. We see a blank page, right? Well, if you have 3 martinis like Caroline, all of the text will become apparent. Once I met a young fellow who very proudly told me he knew Dr. Colorado. This is true. He is an example of how Tom generously gave to Denverites their stories and their city. As a result, made them feel part of the community. That's a remarkable achievement. I did not tell the guy I knew Tom. I didn't tell the guy that I knew Tom. No. Thank you.
How can I say anything bad about a librarian?
How many of you recognize Jim Kroll from his days heading the Western History Department?
Do you know my successor is here tonight? Rachel Trett.
Rachel, you want to testify?
I can't follow that.
But Rachel is in Jim's footsteps, is following. Open that library up there, everyone. Remember this way back when you had to get a letter of approval or certification from somebody to go there. Jim opens that even to, I think, 4th graders studying their Colorado history. And also, I wonder if the wonderful exhibits. Remember, even the most obscure group, Dr. Jim, put an exhibit up on the 5th floor, which I understand Rachel's going to be continuing.
I heard a rumor that the first exhibit after we open is going to be Dr. Colorado.
great champion of the library, Shelby Carr. I'm Jay Mead. I've known Tom for decades now. We live, excuse me, we live in Montclair, just a few blocks from Tom. We have a huge pleasure of seeing Tom and Vi walking around the neighborhood quite often. I was asked recently what is my own contribution to the study of Colorado history, to the recording to Colorado history, and I replied that it's that every time Tom Noel's computer breaks down, I run over and fix it for him. I want to tell you, when Tom's computer breaks down, Tom can't write history, and history stops. So I have, so far as we have any history, I am largely responsible. Tom sets a low bar. I know very little about Windows 10. In fact, I know how to plug the computer back into the wall, which sometimes is useful for solving these kinds of problems. Tom is always, when I've done some work for him, Tom is often nice enough to give him a book from one of his own books from my library, which I'm delighted about. I always appreciate that very much. But Tom has only written 55 books. And I told Tom recently that if he's going to renew his service contract with me, he's got to write some more books. And the E471, that does not. Tom dislikes driving almost as much as his computer, and he often asks me to drive him somewhere downtown to the Cactus Club for lunch, for example. For which I'm always happy to do. One of the great benefits of driving Tom downtown is that a few years ago, as you probably know, he had a little hip surgery, all was well. But in the course of that procedure, he was given one of those handicap parking placards that you hang from your mirror. And when we go downtown, always brings it along. My friends, you have not lived until you have had free parking, any space, any day, any time, anywhere in downtown Denver. Expired meter, loading zone, do not make me laugh. So when Tom asks you to drive him somewhere, and he will, get the placard. We've taken many trips with Tom over the years. I was thinking the other day about one that we took down the Gunnison River, a historical trip, and a canoe trip with a large group. Tom led it. And, I should stop Tom and point out, just to forestall any disappointment. This is not the episode that includes the story of the nude birdwatching. I just want to be clear on that.
That was not me. I do remember that birdwatching getting very excited about the bird.
That's worth having another roast for. Anyway, we had a large group, and that morning we loaded up the boats, and we were just about to head off. And somebody informed us that just ahead, or somewhere ahead, we would be running into the fearsome Hail Mary Rapid. Well, on that sobering note, we all headed down the river, and after lunch, indeed, we heard the dreadful roar of that mighty cataract around the next bend. And so we all pulled our canoes up to the side and we ran down the river, we ran around the bend, and sure enough, there was the white mayhem of the Hail Mary Rapid. Well, we ran up and down, scouting the rapid, planning routes, trying to figure out what we were going to do. And finally, we figured, well, it's time to go. So we walked back up, got back into our canoes. The First couple got back in, headed into the rapid, and they made it through. The next couple, a little bit emboldened, got in, headed through the rapid, they made it through. The next couple, the next couple, the next couple, pretty soon all the couples had made it through the Hail Mary rapid, except one. Tom Noel was in the last boat, and we ran back up the Gunnison, ran back up the bank in order to help him get into that canoe and get down the river. Tom was paired up at that point with a earnest and very charming and slight young teenage girl named Laura. She got into the front of the boat. Tom sat himself in the back of the canoe, along with a case of red wine and a dozen Cuban cigars in a Ziploc bag. Well, I'm not saying that Tom has ever had weight issues. But I'll tell you, he got in that boat, the front of that boat popped up, and poor young Laura could barely get her paddle into the water. So they head on into the rapids. She is paddling like mad. And we see them going into the rapid. I have to say, I'm not sure I saw Tom pick up a paddle, but nevertheless, they made it through under Laura's admirable leadership and pulled up to the side, and we all congratulated them. And Laura asked him how to go back there. And Tom said, well, he added a certain stability to the boat that got them through. And gave her a Cuban cigar. I remember just one other trip of the many, or I was thinking about that decades ago. It was a birding expedition with Tom and Vi and the Barretts and some other families down to the southeast corner of Colorado, to Springfield, Colorado, to see the mating dance of the lesser prairie chicken. Now, that is exactly what it sounds like. We pulled into Springfield, at that time a sort of ramshackle town on a huge prairie, and Tom in the back of the car said, a town like this is going to have a VFW post. And in that VFW post, there's going to be a bar. And sure enough, we soon passed a VFW post. So later that night, Tom and Carol and I went down to the post. We repaired to the bar, and there indeed was a bar. And we sat down, and though there were a bunch of old vets, a bunch of old guys, all basically asleep on the bar. And we sat there for a few minutes, and you know what happened next. Tom stood up and walked to the end of the bar and started shaking guys awake and saying, do you remember anything about the Dust Bowl? Do you remember Dust Bowl days in southeast Colorado? I swear, I remember this. I'm not making this up. And he shook awake everybody at the bar, and one guy brightened up when he heard that question. He said, yeah, I do. And this guy, it turns out, came from Walsh, Colorado, which is even farther east and even more. You're not going to stop me, are you? I swear, 60 seconds. I swear. Okay. And this guy, where was I? Oh, it was in Walsh. Walsh is near the Kansas border. Anyway, he said he remembered, his one story about the Dust Bowl was he remembered being out in the field and his mother come running out and grabbing him and throwing him in the house. And as she got him in the house, he looked up on this bright sunny day and saw that black wall from earth to sky, from horizon to horizon, bearing down on them. And the wind shook that cabin, and the dust came in every crack, and it covered the house, and it covered the fields, and it covered everything. Guy said he was never so scared. But finally, the sun came back out, and he was okay.
Jay, are you wearing a watch?
Purposely, no. And so, the guy said, he looked at us and he said, "I'll never forget that day in my life." And then he lay down on the bar and went back to sleep. So, what do we learn about history from Tom Noel? Well, we learned that history is best done by walking into the VFW posts of this world, shaking the old guys awake, and listening to their stories. And that's how we write it down and truly understand it and pass it on. So thank you, Tom. Congratulations.
Take care.
You're welcome.
Any rebuttal, sir?
Yes, Jay, as you can hear, is a great storyteller and a great talker. And he's often right, often as his wife Carol will point out, he carries on too long.
At least they were good stories.
What about the canoe? Is there any truth to that talk?
Was it true with the canoe?
Yes, this is true. Jay tells mostly the truth.
Was it truly a teenage girl that you gave a cigar?
Is Laura here?
She's not.
Her sister is here.
I can represent.
Yeah, it was.
And Susan is almost as pretty as Laura.
It's fair.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Mead. Calhoun, come on out.
Okay, remember, I gave a few minutes to Steve for all his funniest jokes, so I get credit for those. I get credit for Jay's last joke. And Jim, I have to tell you, this is how I know I'm a competent editor, because whenever I tell one of my reporters that he has to call Tom Noel for a quote, I say, he always will give you a good quote, but don't believe the word he says. You can quote him, but you'll have to fact check it, and don't do it in one of his books. So, that's how I know. This is going to sound a little familiar, thank you, Jim. Those who forget their history are condemned to repeat it, said George Santayana, or maybe Mark Twain, and they said something close enough. But as Tom Noel has proved over and over and over again, you do not need to forget history in order to repeat it. You can keep repeating it over and over and over. You can make a career out of repeating history. You can repeat history for an entire career. And also a hobby, if you happen to like bars, which I do. It was my misfortune to land in Denver after Tom had finished the research for his epic genius work, The City and the Saloon, A Liquid History of Denver, the book I was clearly meant to write, and the thesis many other PhD students would tell you they were meant to do. So instead, I've had to make a career out of fact-checking Tom Noel's work. Fortunately, if you do enough research on this subject, you're going to forget your history, and so you have to do it all over again and again. So thanks for that, Tom. Thanks for making going to bars respectable. Unfortunately, as I'm sure many people in here have learned, you might be minding your own business in a bar, doing some research of your own, when in will come Tom and Dennis and 20, bless their hearts, paying tuition students who think they're learning real facts. And it's not bad enough what they've already had to swallow from their 2 leaders. They would pull you off your bar stool and ask you to tell a story, maybe about the little baby angels, or about everything I always had to make stories up about. Often John Hickenlooper, because that was the bar I was usually in, since it was across from our office. But thank you for never letting me drink in peace. I have another reason to thank Tom for making me respectable, or as respectable as I'm ever going to get. For a Colorado History Group production, The Trial of Alfred Packer, or Alfred Packer, that spelling debate alone isn't good for a week in a bar. He cast me as Mrs. Lionel Campbell Ross O'Brien, a social activist with such a mouthful of a name that she wisely took the name of Polly Pry as her pen name. As a crusading journalist, she actually wrote the story of the U.S. building the Panama Canal, and for the Denver Post, she put her investigative skills to work on such works as Our Insane Treatment of the Insane. While researching a story about Colorado's prison system, she used her considerable charms to get an interview with Alfred Packer, the Colorado cannibal, who admitted that yes, he had eaten his companions in the mountains, but he had politely waited for them to die first. Persuaded that he was innocent of murder, she convinced the owners of the Post to hire a lawyer to help clear Packer's name, and he was ultimately released from prison. He ended his life near Littleton, a vegetarian. Which, of course, was almost as big a crime in those days. Meanwhile, Polly Pry had learned that the lawyer was taking payment from Packer, too, and so she and her bosses confronted him in the Post's offices, where the lawyer shot both Bonkeys and Tamman. When he was ready to shoot Tamman again, Pry jumped in front of the attorney, telling the gunman that if he tried to shoot Tamman again, he would hit her first, and since she was the most popular writer in Colorado, he would get the death penalty. Clearly, this was a very long time ago when people actually read newspapers. When people actually hired history professors to write columns. But we believe it's true. Polly saved her bosses by using her dress to staunch the bleeding. I was not as noble for the Colorado History Group, but I did use my dress to staunch the flow of beer in the bar afterwards. When Tom wasn't putting on plays or teaching or researching, he was writing more books, of course. The City and the Saloon was just the start of his noble career. And because he's retiring doesn't mean that he'll be shy in retiring regarding opportunities to write still some more books and maybe collect some more cash. Here are some of them that he's lined up and might not have told you about yet. The follow-up to the E470 book, Full Speed Ahead, the engineering marvel of I-70 in the Glenwood Canyon. This one's very short, it won't take you long. The Wit and Wisdom of Lauren Boebert. This one's short too. Favorite Recipes from Casa Bonita. Pleased to meet you. Your favorite recipes from Alfred Packer. This one Dennis is going to help you write. My Dinner with Phil Goodstein. Molly Brown's Stinkers and Sinkers. Boom and Bust Wines, Colorado at the Diamond Cabaret. Making Bank off the Women's Bank. The City and the Pot Shop. And finally, an updated volume of Colorado, the Highest State.
How many of you know that magazine called Waste Worker? And I was a co-founder, as I recall, of that. We miss your columns there. They should be every week, you know.
There's a thing called the internet, where they often are every day.
How many of you have seen the best of Westward Awards? You know, the little plaque that you get, Steve Weil has, some of the other staff. And Patty Calhoun has received more than anyone, and she's invented constantly new categories to get best of Denver in. You know, like the best donut shop, or this, the best that. and she has won all of those awards. If you go to her office down there on Broadway, you'll see the wall is paper, the best of Denver awards to Patty Calhoun. But she deserves it.
All right, Patty Calhoun. Okay.
Thank you. So hi, I'm Shelby, for those of you who don't know me. My roast is a little bit more of a toast, but slightly a roast with some anecdotes, because I'm not a big roaster, but I'm doing my best. So I was a former graduate student of Tom's, and he honestly was a real mentor and advisor to me while I was in the program. During my time at CU, we kind of were split into two camps in the public history department. We were either more in the museum studies, sort of known as Rebecca students, or we were Tom students. And by the end of my graduate school career, I was absolutely known as a Tom student. Actually, a few of my classmates used to joke that I wrote the book on Tom Noel, which really just meant that I knew how to get an A in his class, because I took literally every class he taught for 3 years. And I knew I had really made it when I was assigned to run the PowerPoints for every single one of his lectures. So that was a really big moment for me. I took over for some great people before me. But I'll never forget that my first semester of graduate school, my first class I ever took was from Tom, and it was Colorado history, which is a definite classic, of course. And I learned a lot of valuable lessons from Tom, and my favorite classes were always our walking tours. And I really truly thought that graduate study of history meant having fun taking walking tours and drinking alcohol, because that's pretty much what we did. Every good walking tour always has to end at a fabulous bar. And that was back in the days when our professors were actually allowed to invite us over for lectures, where we would get to see Tom's fabulous library. Vi would treat us to some great pizza, and we would walk around and just drink a lot of wine. And that was my first semester of graduate school, and I just thought I was really gonna love my program. Unfortunately, that's not how it ended, but I really enjoyed the entire process. During my first semester, Tom offered us all the opportunity to volunteer for extra credit in the History Colorado cemetery tours. And I was incredibly excited to combine my love of performing with my love of history. I'm actually a professional dancer, and I travel the world performing, and I'm an NFL cheerleader now. But at the time, I didn't tell anyone that in graduate school, but of course somehow Tom found out. And the second he found out, I was no longer just portraying Lena Stoiber. I had to be a dancing Countess and Lena Stoiber and Countess Murat and everything else in all of these different cemetery tours. So my first cemetery tour with Tom, I showed up for the day. I was dressed in my period attire, and I stood up there and I was Countess Murat, and I started talking about my life as the Countess. And as soon as I was finished, Tom turned on the music and he looks at me and he's like, "You ready? Go!" And I danced on my own grave. So that was really fun. Actually, a few weeks ago, Tom called me and he said, "You know, Shelby, what would be really fabulous at my retirement ceremony if you would do a dance." I thought that was a really lovely thing to ask. However, in formal attire and the space provided, I really wasn't sure if a dance or a cheer would be appropriate tonight. But I can give you a little COLORADO, Colorado Rocks. But of course, leave it up to Tom to want to liven up an already very lively roast with a little song and dance, because you can never have enough entertainment when Tom's around. But truly, I had an amazing time in graduate school, and Tom really made my experience at CU Denver. I would not be where I am today without him, without his guidance and his mentorship throughout this entire process. I'm starting a PhD program this month thanks to Tom and his mentorship and his help in my professional history career. And looking around this room, I know he's impacted and advised so many of us over his lengthy career, and I'm just so honored to be able to be up here tonight and talk to you all. So thank you, Tom, for everything that you've done for all of us.
Shelby forgot to mention she has a brand new book out on Mrs. Crawford Hill.
Tonight's not about me. But I do. Tom wrote the forward for the book, so he's plugging himself too.
And also, she's just been accepted by the Philadelphia Eagles as a cheerleader. So
Oh, it's fabulous. Although I'm sorry in a room full of dendrites to say go birds.
All right, Shelby Carr.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Thank you, sir.
Go to be in England now that April's there. Good. You can hear me okay? Never been accused of needing a microphone. But I just want to say to Tom what fun it is to be here on this wonderful occasion for someone that I've called a friend for a long time. And I'll never forget when I took Tom on his first tour. It was over in Globeville in 1968 with the League of Women Voters on a bus, but we would get off and go down the blocks, and I can remember 46th and Pennsylvania, where Mrs. Agnes Stuka would come out. I alerted her that we were coming by with the League of Women Voters, and in she goes, and she says, "Come on in, come on down the basement." And she said, "I'm going to have you smell the sweet Slovenian sauerkraut, not sour like that Charman's." And she would present us with all these wonderful treats and recipes from Globeville. And then we would go past St. Joe's Polish Church, we'd go past the Slovenian Church, the Germans from Russia Church, and that's how we introduced people to that wonderful neighborhood called Globeville, which is still suffering the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune from an unforgiving and unkind city. And then I remember so much the wonderful, then Tom and I were looking for some gigs to do, and we come up with a bar and church tour. And we called it Saints and Sinners. And so we would arrange for a visit to a church, and then we would go to a local restaurant and have a lunch. So this one day was the Feast of St. Rocco down in Mount Carmel. And so I called Gaetano's, and we got a spot to have our lunch after. And then, so Tom invites this guy, Paulie Villano, who just got out of jail. And Tom invites him to come and give a talk on what it was like growing up in North Denver amongst all the Italian people. And so then on top of that, he invites a reporter from the Rocky Mountain News to come along. So here's Paulie talking about this, and then the reporter, Mark, who I shall remain nameless, Mark says, "Why won't this guy give me his last name?" "Oh, he's shy," I said. "He doesn't want to talk about it." And the very next week, Mark calls me and says, "You know that restaurant we were in North Denver? They found weapons in the basement." I said, "Well, but they were very clean." They were very
And I remember Paulie Villano said that you complimented him, said, "What a clean bar this is." And Villano said, "If you were raided every week, you'd be real clean too."
That's right. Yeah, that's true. We did. So we had a great time, and then we did the trials of Alfred Packer up in Leadville, and there was a song that was written for our little trial, and it went like this. It was written by Patrick Mendoza, and it's about Al Packer, and it goes like this. Oh, Al, you were the bosom pal You bit the hand that fed you, and an arm and a leg and a thigh. Gave new meaning to the word shishka, Bob. Chuck, roast. Several Republicans tried to get me to introduce a bill to make that our state song, but I refused. Then we did the cemetery tours, and I'll never forget the wonderful...
You forgot the other line about how he was sentenced, which would explain your political references.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the judge, when he sentenced Alfred Packer, he said, "You man-eating son of a bitch, there are only 7 Democrats in this county, and you man-eating son of a bitch, you ate 5 of them." And they're still eating Democrats alive down there in that part of Colorado. And but then we went what did we do? What did we do next? Let's see, we did the cemetery tours. Oh yeah, we did these wonderful cemetery tours, all the different cemeteries. And so Tom would, again, he'd see a stone and say, "Oh, here's an interesting stone. Here lies a lawyer and an honest man." And then my line was, "How did they ever fit 2 bodies in a small grave like that?" So we had a great time. But it was through those cemetery tours that people, by seeing the students like Shelby do the reenactments, that really made people love history. And then, so as I close here tonight, I just want to say what a great teacher Tom is and was. And count in your own life the number of teachers that you would call great. And I would count Tom as one of those teachers in my life who helped me learn and appreciate Colorado history. And I would say in close, let my glory be that I could call Tom Noel a friend.
Dennis, don't you have a songbird with you who was going to sing for us? Elizabeth Campbell.
Well, I wish she would. I've asked her. I've asked Elizabeth already. Elizabeth, are you still here? Elizabeth, would you give us a short aria in English or Italian or Latin or whatever you'd like? Let's have her do it, and she can have my extra 2 minutes. Here she is, Elizabeth Caswell. Elizabeth Caswell Dyer.
I'll just hold it out. Okay. So I haven't sung this since I was in Leadville, trying to hit a high D at 10,000 feet, but this is something from Baby Doe for you. Oh, Willow, when we met together, Willow.
Willow, when our love was new. Willow, if he once should be retired, pray tell him I am weeping too. Oh,
Good evening, everybody. You'll be happy to know I am the last roaster. And what a wonderful evening this is, what a wonderful opportunity to roast and to toast Thomas Jacob Noel, a gentleman and a scholar, a lover of wine, women, and song. As a graduate student of Tom's and later as a teaching assistant, I was always amazed at his amazing talent for recognizing particularly bright, passionate, and usually attractive female students and turning them into prostitutes. Dead prostitutes for his Halloween semitosiums. His boneyard magic was amazing. Over the years, I saw him transform Japanese Americans into Arapaho Indians, a particularly sturdy male student into a fetching Agnes Tannen, and a petite Hispanic young girl into an absolutely convincing Colonel John Shivington. So although Tom says he is retiring, I suspect that he's actually been recruited by Hogwarts School of Wizardry as their next professor of necromancy. I hear they pay way better than CU Denver. It was my privilege to co-author 3 books with Tom, and one could not ask for a more generous or genial collaborator. But when it came to promoting the books, occasionally he could disappoint. For example, soon after we finished our first joint effort, he was asked to speak on that book in a program for a luncheon for the CU alumni. He had spoken many times to this group. He was a favorite. They loved him. But for some reason on this occasion, he was disinclined. To get out of the commitment, he went so far as to have a heart attack the day before the program. I had to pinch it and put together a last-minute PowerPoint, and I guess I did okay, because for my efforts, the CU Alumni Association gave me $500, a beautiful bouquet, and a gigantic stuffed Ralphie buffalo. All of which were intended for you, Tom. So no hard feelings, but I hope you will think twice before pulling a stunt like that again. As many of you know, Tom is also an accomplished gardener who takes palpable pride in the results of the wonderful things that he has cultivated. And I think the same might be said for his career in public history. He has planted countless seeds and fertilized them with his own very unique brand of Colorado history compost. A fragrant and fermented conglomeration composed of things like jackalope carcasses and fur-bearing trout bones. And let's see, Thomas lightning dregs, nuggets of wisdom, kernels of truth, and a very generous helping of balderdash. From this very fertile compost have sprouted authors and archivists, educators and curators, preservationists and politicians, tour guides and docents, and even a hotel historian. In praise of that compost and its incomparable creator, I have written new words to the classic cowboy ballad, Tom Dooley. I hope you will sing along. We are lucky to be accompanied this evening by Tom's very talented nephew, Christopher Noel, who is a genuine guitar picker from Tennessee. And you can thank him for the fact that you will not have to endure my terrible rendition on the ukulele. So thank you.
Does everyone know the tune to Tom Dooley?
Oh, yeah. Maybe play through it once, yeah. All right.
All right, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Hold up your head, Tom. Noel. Hold up your head real high. Spread with your history almost. The past will never die. Tom studied liquid history. Gave every bar a try. In a saloon in Lodo, found him a wife called Mine. He knew down with money, offered a million tracks, spiced up his tales with humor, and just a pinch of sex. Tom's faithful history sidekick, Senator Dennis G. Rabbit of hold of policy for WFAC. Baby Dirty and Alfred, and boy and Mrs. Brown spoke up at Tom's mock trials, shot misconceptions down. Take it, Chris. Legions of Noel groupies, real to his point of view. Dead people and old buildings sparkle with life anew. Trying to roast this icon turns out to be damn hard. Dear Dr. Colorado, we're proud to call you hard. Hold up your head, Tom Noel. Hold up your head real high. Thanks to your history almost, the past will never die. The past will never die. Yeah! Thank you all so much. Thank you, Chris.
Any rebuttal, Tom?
How many of you know Debra Faulkner as the historian of If you haven't done one of Deborah's tours, sign up for them. She, as you can see, brings history alive, makes it bring even. And much of my success as a writer in those 55 books is due to people like Debra and Shelby and Steve Leonard and Dennis Gallagher and other folks here. Couldn't do it without you.
Oh.
Thank you. You all know Steve Weil of Rockville, Western Wearing, where they sell the snap button shirts. And Steve tells me the reason for a snap button shirt is when you rip it open, it attracts the opposite sex.
Except in
He also
Tom's case.
sold shirts to the stars of Brokeback Mountain. And there, they attracted the... Go ahead.
Wait a minute. So I want to make sure this isn't a eulogy, right? And by the way, was it really 55 books or does it just seem that way? You know, Tom's been a friend to all of us here and much more. And I do seriously want to say a few things. When in this time of polarization politically, when others talk about history with an agenda, Tom gives it context. And for that, I'm very grateful. And I think about all the things he's done that's had a material impact. About 20 years ago, he led a tour of Fisher & Fisher buildings, and I don't even think I knew my building was by Fisher & Fisher. But it inspired me to go to the Western History Collection and find the archive and learn all about my building, and we even found the original plans. And that's all because of the tour Tom led. He introduced me to many, many things that I'm very grateful. The Debra Posse of Westerners, the Cactus Club, whose stimulating conversations only surpassed by my weight gain. I just want to say thank you, Tom. You've really done a lot for all of us here, and that's all I have to say.